Welcome you all to today's research seminar series. We are organizing this program on Zoom, and this program is being broadcast live on the Facebook page of Martin Chaudhary. The title of today's seminar is Policy Making for Community Radio, Cross, Cross-Country Experiences and Learning in South Asia. And our speaker is Preeti Rangunath, incoming lecturer, Media and Communication, Monash University, Malaysia. As usual, today's program has two phases. In the beginning, our main speaker will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. Then our floor will be open, and then we can put questions and comments to our main speaker. Those who have joined through Facebook page Facebook can use comment box, or those who are connected through Zoom can use raise hand option or chat box. We prefer raise hand option. Uh, Let me draw your attention to our next program. On 26 October, we are having discussion on health policy discussion series. The title is Mental Health, Under Prioritized and Emerging. Our speakers are Jagannath Lamisane, President, Juggernaut Mindset, Pragya Rimal, Psychologist, Senior Mental Health Research Manager from Possible, and Sandesh Rakal, Lecturer, Central Department of Psychology, Tribhuvan University. Let me introduce our main speaker. Preeti Raghunath is a scholar who is interested in global media studies, media policy studies, and ethnographic methods in South Asia. She has published academic articles in journals such as Global Media and Communication, Economic and Political Weekly, and Media Development. She has also published the book Community Radio Policies in South Asia, or Deliberative Policy Ecology Approach in 2020. This book is based on her PhD dissertation on the comparative study of policymaking for community radio in Nepal, Sri Lanka, India, and Bangladesh. Now, I would like to request Preeti to deliver her talk. Preeti, now it's your turn.
Thank you so much, Harsha. Firstly, I want to thank you for inviting me for this talk. And also, I want to thank you personally because I'm somebody who's benefited from the kind of work that you do at Martin Chaudhary, that all of you do at Martin Chaudhary, because like I mentioned, I was there for my fieldwork a few years ago in Nepal. And Martin Chaudhary was one place where I found some resource material. I conducted an interview, and I've been following the work being done and the publishing that has happened over the last many years by the organization. So thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. What I'll be doing today, unfortunately, I was prepared with a PowerPoint presentation, but I have a power cut at my end. So I've logged in from my phone and I have my PowerPoint in front of me. So I'll just use it as a guideline to speak. And I'll be reading some excerpts from my book to illustrate certain points that I'm making and to share some ethnographic insights from my fieldwork, which I'll talk about in detail as we progress. So maybe I can begin by sharing the contours of my research project. How did the idea come about and what did I set out doing, just by virtue of providing a background to where I was coming from when I approached this research and conceptualized it. For starters, I have a background in international relations and politics, and therefore I was very interested in looking at policies and policy making in South Asia. And I had been a journalist for a bit, and I've always engaged with media in my work, in the sense that I have a bachelor's in journalism and mass communication, and I did another master's in mass communication. So the idea was to bring these two interests of mine into one ambit. And when I got the chance to do the PhD in communication, I thought, why not focus on policy making for something like community radio in South Asia? That was really where I was coming from. And the reason I chose community radio was because, firstly, I was located at an institution which had specializations in something like this. They are known for their work in communication for social change. And secondly, I was very interested in looking at non-state media. And I was, and as somebody who's a critical researcher and I'm trying to be a critical scholar, the idea is to not only study private, by private, I mean corporate media. The idea was to go beyond corporate media and the state to study other kinds of media entanglements in various ways. And therefore, when I got the opportunity to work on something like community radio, I was very interested, right? And therefore, while a lot of the work on community radio, especially from India, focuses a lot on profiling the community radio stations, studying audiences, studying community, studying programming, I was more interested in looking at the policy making for it, because I was interested in studying the various kind of actors involved in the policy process for something like community radio, which brought in a range of policy actors. From, of course, there is the state, but there is also, I'm just admitting people as I speak, sorry. Yeah, but there is also, I mean, a lot of non-state actors, including activists, advocates for community radios, international development and donor agencies, etc. So the idea is, or was, to bring together the focus of politics of policy making for community radio in South Asia. And I chose the 4 countries which I studied, which is Sri Lanka, Nepal, India, and Bangladesh, because the focus was to study those countries which have had experiences with community radio in a big way. For instance, each of the countries that I'm talking about have had trajectories that offer, I mean, that have to be documented when it comes to understanding and studying community radio, and a comprehensive work on South Asia had not been done before. So this is where I saw that, you know, one can place, this is the research gap, and one can really contribute academically and in a scholarly way to this area of work. That's really where I started. Now, when it comes to the study of policy, and I mean, me included, our starting point is, of course, the policy document a lot of times. But in places where there are no policy documents, or in places where the documents are very sparsely worded, for instance, one has to go beyond the policy document to study processes, practices, the various actors involved, and the various contexts in which all of this functions, right? And that is where I thought, instead of doing a content analysis of policy documents, if I could do something like an ethnography, which is more of an in-depth qualitative study of policy making for this form of media, it would be a useful addition, again, because I've always been somebody who's been fascinated by anthropological works. And when I got the chance to bring in methodological perspectives and a sensibility from anthropology into my work, I thought, you know, I should be able to do it. So that really helped me shape the ambit of my work in various ways. And thanks to a couple of grants, small grants that I was able to secure, I really could do fieldwork in these 4 countries, including India, because I am not from Delhi. So policy making is a very capital city oriented kind of a process, or a, you know, that kind of a work. And therefore, I had to go do my ethnography in Delhi. I went to Nepal, I went to Kathmandu, Colombo in Sri Lanka, Dhaka in Bangladesh, but also some other places in these countries. For instance, I went to Dhulikhel in Nepal, which is not very far from Kathmandu, but for me, you know, looking at some stations, community radio stations, and how they operationalize these, what are these nationally made policies at the station level, also became important. I traveled to Kandy in Sri Lanka. I traveled to Munshiganj in Bangladesh, which is also close to Dhaka. And in India, I've done quite a bit of travel to a lot of these community radio stations. I've gone to what are called the most backward regions and districts in Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh in central India, etc. So that is really the ambit of my work. Now, what I'll do is, I'll talk a bit about the ethnography, which I did very quickly, and then I can move into the reflections from the ethnography itself. the ethnography was done with diverse policy actors. So some of the key components of my ethnography was, of course, participant observations, formal, semi-structured, in-depth interviews, informal conversations, of course, field notes and everything else that goes into the preparation of a proper ethnography of policy was done. And this was done across these 4 countries. And it was important for me to approach policy making also in a slightly more non-traditional sense. And I'll explain what I mean by that. When I say policy making, we think of government ministries. We think of, perhaps in India, because the private players are so big, we think of corporate boardrooms, etc. The idea in this case, in my work, was to look at policy making, of course, in government ministries and corporate boardrooms, but also in a range of other informal policy making venues, like track two dialogues, like conferences and seminars, like sites where activists meet, embedding myself in NGOs or organizations which act as the nodes of various community radio related activities, etc. So, for instance, I'm thinking about, for example, BNNRC in Bangladesh. I was able to sit in on some meetings that they were organizing and take part in their interactions with international donor agencies to understand how donor agendas function, how international aid functions, international development aid functions, etc. So that is one way of, that was what I was doing for the ethnography in terms of participant observation. In terms of interviews, in-depth, semi-structured interviews and informal conversations, towards the end, I had a little more than 100 such interviews across these 4 countries, including informal conversations, of course. So it gave me a large corpus of material to deal with. And I was also looking at archival data. For instance, the Center for Study of Developing Societies, CSDS, has a project or a media-centric project called Sarai. They had actually run they host the archives of what is called the CR India archive, the Community Radio India archive, where a lot of the discussions from early 2000s, about 10 plus years worth of discussions, online discussions, notifications, meetings, online interactions, all of that has been documented and is there as an archive. So I dipped into that archive quite a bit as well to get a sense of how to understand the historical aspect of community radio in India, but it had information on some other countries as well. So it gave me a sense of the larger landscape that I was dealing with. And when it comes to delineating the actors for the policy study, for the policy ethnography, I was looking at actors including former and current bureaucrats working within the ministries of information and communication, home affairs, all the ministries that are involved with community radio in these countries. I was looking at actors that make up what are called the epistemic communities with respect to community radios in each of these countries. For instance, I was, of course, looking at ACORAB in Nepal. I spoke to NEFEJ in Nepal. Similarly, I looked at BNNRC in Bangladesh. In Sri Lanka, they didn't have such a body, but I spoke to a number of senior journalists and practitioners who worked on community-based broadcasting in the island. In India, I spoke to individuals from bodies like the Community Radio Forum, which is now defunct, and the Community Radio Association of India, etc. And I was also talking to a number of representatives from international organizations like AMAC, like UNESCO, UNICEF, International Media Support, etc. I also spoke to researchers, observers studying the sector, media law experts, technology law experts, representatives of community radio stations themselves, including some visits to these stations in each of these countries and more densely in India as well. So this is the landscape of my ethnography and the policy actors who informed my work. And now I'll move on to some excerpts from my book, to help illustrate the point that I'm trying to make today, which is to reflect on some. I mean, of course, each of these countries have had individual trajectories, but there have been some commonalities which sort of have worked for each of these countries to draw from in terms of understanding each other's experiences and some cross-country learnings. But also this is important because it helps me understand the larger, I mean, when I was looking at towards the end, how do I write this? I mean, how do I write this entire corpus of research that I've collected? Do I just do a cross-country comparison? Because that would be a different kind of a study, because what happens when you do a cross-country comparison is sometimes you can't do comparisons primarily because the experiences are so different, and therefore you will have a lot of fluidities, especially in South Asia, right? And I'll come to all of that in a bit in terms of material from my work. So this kind of a conceptualization of a regional kind of an understanding, a South Asianness, if you will, becomes important in order to defy strict comparisons and to make a case then for the region as a heuristic. And that's why the idea of deliberation
हर्षजी उहाँ अड्केको हो
through which they fund projects or they fund organizations, etc., in terms of their priority areas. So a lot of times the kind of trajectories that community radio has taken in the region, while they've been very different, they've had some kind of cross-country learnings and experiences that I will reflect on moving ahead now. So let me jump into one quotation from my work, and I mean, I'll start with that. So during my fieldwork to Sri Lanka in February 2014, this was of course after I visited Nepal, I was able to meet the Danish broadcaster who had mooted the idea of community broadcasting in the country, also a first for the South Asian region. In 1978, Mr. Knud Ebbesen, who worked with Radio Denmark, visited the island, living for 2 months each in Vellavata, Kandy, and Colombo. And when I asked him to, and I was fortunate to meet him, and I mean, he was visiting the country when I was also visiting the country, and I went to Kandy to meet him. And when I asked him to narrate the story of his experiences from the late 1970s with community radio in the country, he started by asking me, do you want the official story or the unofficial one? And he went on to provide both versions, which only got me thinking about the seamlessness that often characterizes an individual actor's practice of policy, right? So he said, I was here in Sri Lanka for personal reasons. To finance my stay here, I was looking at how radio could be used in development. This was also the time when Sri Lanka had a big dam project that had happened, that was taking place, the construction of the Mahavali Dam. And a number of these communities along that river had been uprooted and displaced. And they were looking to media in some ways and radio in some ways to rebuild community connections. So they were envisaging radio in a big way, in a different way from being just a state broadcaster. So he said, back home, I was with the Public Access Department of Radio Denmark and worked on the tape workshop, wherein I would invite people to the station, enabling the Danish broadcaster to transform itself from a monopoly to providing open access to the public. Our first experiment with community radio was in the late 1977, covering 40,000 people. My first visit to Sri Lanka allowed me to interact with officials at the Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation. I met the then Director General Tevis Guruge, who, as well as scholars like Sarath Amunugama, who was an advocate of two-way participatory communication. About a year later, Sarath asked me to come up with a proposal for the people in the Mahavali areas where 1,25,000 families had been rehabilitated due to large-scale irrigation project. He felt something like the initiative back home would be helpful to the people there. So even in the beginning, you see that the idea why there could have been a felt need among the community, it was really, it came from a transnational kind of an angle for starters. And I mean, I go on to narrate the story of how he worked with the UNESCO, DANIDA, and with the Sri Lankan government, that is the Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation, to come up with programs on Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation's radio stations to serve the communities that I'm talking about, which is in the Mahabali area. And all these details have been laid out in chapter 4 of my book. But I'll go on to then talk about, of course, I'm a little nervous to talk about Nepal, especially in a forum like this. But this is, of course, from my research in the country. And while this was the situation in Sri Lanka of the late 1970s and 1980s, when community broadcasting had really taken place in the country, in the island, Nepal was undergoing shifts in its polity as well. A state characterized by crypto-coloniality, and this is a concept that was very useful. It's been put forth by Hersfeld, who spoke about how Nepal was never a British colony, but because of trade relations with the other British colonies and with British India at that time, a lot of the administrative setups mirrored those of the colonies, and there was a transfer of some kind of an administrative culture in some sense. And therefore, he calls this crypto-coloniality. So I say, a state characterized by crypto-coloniality combined with the panchayat system that invoked ideas of a Hindu kingdom backed by monarchy was challenged by the Jan Andolan Ban in 1990. This people's movement itself was a culmination of events like a referendum in 1980 and civil disobedience for reform towards restoration of a multi-party system in 1985. And therefore, I give a little bit of the historical details where I speak about the context building for understanding the entry of, or the coming of independent radio in Nepal, which is the first in the South Asian region. And while Sri Lanka had community-based radio, but it was still run under the Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation. In Nepal, I've read the book of, and I also spoke to a number of people. Now I'm connected with Mr. Bharat Datta Koirala, but otherwise, I think Adhikari's work, which profiles the public life of Bharat Datta Koirala, narrates this push for the opening up of the airwaves to public in Nepal. And the book highlights this incident that had taken place, which is during a tea party hosted by the premier, where Koirala was present. UNESCO's communication representative raised the topic of opening up airwaves for private radio. The Prime Minister was concerned that private radio stations in a country surrounded by big nations could hurt the sentiments of the neighbors. The UNESCO representative explained that they were talking about small local radio stations. The Prime Minister turned to Koirala and asked, "Don't you think it's a good idea, small radio stations for local communities?" Koirala confirmed that they were talking about small community radios. In that case, the Prime Minister said there was no problem, it could be done. But Koirala knew his words had to be conveyed to his functionaries if they were to be translated into action. So, I mean, here, this is just an indication of how a verbal assurance for something like independent radio, which eventually we know as community radio, was given along the sidelines of a meeting in 1991, where there was a verbal assurance that was given. I then go on to highlight the Singh Darbar mindset, where a number of, I have some information on how a high-level task force was convened on media policy, was convened by the communications minister then, Narahari Acharya, in 1992. The media policy prevalent until then had been drafted in 1971 and had further institutionalized tight control of the state over the media. So there was a high-level task force comprising people from diverse areas, and Rajendra Dahal, a friend of Bharat Datta Koirala and also a representative of the NEFEJ, was part of the task force. And I had interviewed Rajendra Dahal, and he said at that time, FM technology was new technology and we had a new democracy. Koirala and I thought it was a good opportunity. He was very well traveled and mentioned the experiments in Philippines and asked me to press for including the word or the phrase private FM in the draft policy. And that's how the word private, the introduction of the word private in the draft policy was then interpreted as non-state. And therefore you have private FM channels and community radios coming into the country. But I think what was really fascinating for me was, the Save Independent Radio movement, which I think was a huge, gave a huge impetus to countries, especially like India, where what had happened was, in India, you have a Supreme Court judgment of 1996, which laid the ground for 1995, which laid the ground for the opening up of the airwaves it spoke about how airwaves are public property. And after that, you have a number of declarations in India, a couple of declarations which aimed at opening up the airwaves to public, to communities. But the government was very, very scared and skeptical. They kept citing the Rwandan experience, and they had licensed it out to educational institutions alone. But I think the Nepalese experience with independent FM and independent radio, especially with the Save Independent Radio movement, has been an eye-opener and sort of helped in a big way, allowed the countries in the region to lobby for, and advocate for community radio. So here I talk about, in the book, I talk about the Save Independent Radio movement. I speak about how there was, and this is of course coming from my interview with Mr. Raghu Manali, who has been such an inspiring figure. And he spoke about a multi-pronged strategy where they targeted the diplomatic community, where the media was brought in for larger solidarities, especially at the height of the King's crackdown, and where a number of these initiatives and larger solidarities in 2005 especially led to this particular movement. And this movement is something that sort of has helped India look at community radio through a new light, because a year after that, in 2006 in India, you had the airwaves opening up to communities, which was earlier only restricted to educational institutions because you could easily monitor these institutions. And just these experiences from Sri Lanka informed a number of experiments in other countries at that point. But Nepalese experience with independent radio has been quite an interesting one. I see a hand up there.
Let's go on.
Okay.
Yeah, let's go on.
Okay. So at this point, I'd like to bring in the experiences from Bangladesh, which I haven't spoken about. India, I have introduced a little bit, and I'll be happy to take any questions across any of these experiences of any of these countries. With Bangladesh, community radio has been, the trajectory has been, in a big way inspired by the experiences of the other countries. And in this case, it's been in the Indian experience, where you had somebody like Mr. Bazlur Rahman of BNRC visiting India and interacting with people at the community radio forum, people in the community radio movement in India, where and he took back some ideas, and he was already working on participatory development and participatory communication. And he, along with people like Massline Media Center, who were really the pioneers in bringing up this idea in Bangladesh, they collaboratively came up with a strategy to advocate with the government there. And in 2008, you had a policy which came out, which allowed communities and NGOs to broadcast for their communities. And when I was doing my field work, it was interesting to see that the licensing had been done in a phased manner. They were covering various districts in the country. They were covering the areas that were more disaster prone. So development and disaster have been the two priorities for community radio in Nepal, and their policy making has been one where it's possibly called the idea of policy transfer in some ways, or I mean, the idea of knowledge communities and epistemic communities have played a big way, because I mean, because it's interesting how certain ideas travel across countries and then influence the government, and how you educate. A lot of times at a lot of meetings, the ministers were called, the joint secretaries were called, and this has been the case in India as well, where you bring in all these government authorities to these civil society groups and influence policies in a number of ways. So my book has some illustrations of how that has happened in India and Bangladesh. So I'm just giving you a slice of the landscape of community radio. Of course, when you do an ethnography and then make a presentation, it's very hard to distill all the ethnographic content. But I'll be happy to reflect on any particular instances that you may want me to speak about or reflect on in the Q&A. And you can tell me at what point we can start the question and answer, or if I have some more time, then I can go into some more of these trajectories that each of these countries have taken.
You still have time.
Okay. Oh, I still have time.
Yeah, please, you still have time.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so I'll possibly read out one instance of community-based broadcasting from Sri Lanka, which I think in a big way also illustrated how educational radio has functioned in the region. And this also illustrates, is a good example of the South Asian nation state in a big way. We're not talking about the state of today, but a state of the 1980s and the 1990s, for instance. I mean, there is a section called the practice of community broadcasting, epistemic forms and manifestations. And this is, of course, about Sri Lanka, where I use the idea of practice, which is in its interpretive form, hermeneutic, discursive, and dialogic, and emerges critical and contributing to the deepening of democracy. So Sri Lanka is seen as a pioneer in participatory and what is now being called community-based broadcasting in the South Asian region. The opening up of the economy and the entry of transnational actors, processes of modernization, and the everyday efforts on ground allow for an understanding of this manifestation of community broadcasting. So when we speak about participation, a scholar like Uphoff talks about 4 ways of participation observed in participatory communication for development, which is participation in implementation, participation in evaluation, participation in benefit, and participation in decision making. So Mr. Sunil Vijay-Singhe, who is one of the oldest community broadcasters, practitioners in Sri Lanka, spoke to me. And he spoke about how the broadcasting radius of the station was 25 kilometers. Sometimes even down south, they could hear us. The focus of programming was on health, education, entertainment, dramas. We had a news program called Kada Mandia, which means bazaar or market. This was the mode of providing news wherein we could gather information from the village. There was a Kade Akka, meaning shop girl, who would discuss news in that bazaar environment. We would also have the village headman or Ranbanda who would talk to her and they would discuss daily happenings. So this is just to give you a sense of how programming was done in a community-oriented way. But one instance of education interfacing with community broadcasting is through what is called, or what was called, the New Education Service and Campus Radio. Even as participatory development in the context of Mahavali Resettlement Plan was an entry point to understanding the community-based broadcasting in the country, another version of community broadcasting was articulated by an official of the Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation. And this is Mr. Tilina Samarasuriya, who is the Director, Training and Foreign Relations, SLBC, who spoke about the New Education Service. elaborating on this way of non-formal education as a way, as a lens to understand the efforts of broadcasting, of community broadcasting. He demarcated this form of broadcasting service from the traditional education service, which was founded to care for the educational needs of school children um, in the whole country. So he went on to speak about the new education service with me, and he said the NES was a bold experiment where we designed a project to bring the principles and concepts of community radio into the mainstream radio here in Sri Lanka. The team of educational broadcasters under Tilak Jayaratne, who is a veteran broadcaster in Sri Lanka, decided that the educational service, as such, should cover much more, especially in the non-formal and informal domains in education. But and how do they go about identifying the diverse communities, treating each of them as different ones, having their own set of unmet needs, issues, and problems to deal with? He went on to speak about this. He spoke about blue collar workers, commuters, white collar workers, etc. And he then went on to narrate an incident where, the community broadcaster, the SLBC's initiative of NES had to be put to an end because of an incident where with the labor minister being hauled up by some of the participants on the program, and they had to actually shut it on air. And that was the end of this initiative of the NES. So we see, one feature that sort of unifies the South Asian nation states in a big way has been the power of the state. And today we are seeing the resurgence of the modern day nation state in a big way, albeit in different, the contours and the functioning is very, very different. The priorities are very different, and we see the collusion of newer actors with the state. But this is just to illustrate how something like the new education service was imagined for as community broadcasting, and how the state played a big role in getting it stopped because of one incident where the labor minister was called up and brought on air to answer some queries along the labor code and along lines of ethical functioning and working conditions, etc. And this is what led to the stopping of this initiative. Of course, I have some work on how the collective action for community radio took place in Sri Lanka, and I'm crisscrossing between countries to give you a sense of the time. I mean, in the sense that the way I've written the book is not for not country wise. It crisscrosses between time to unfold it in not in a linear fashion, but in a to defy linearity, because experiences in the region sort of defy linearity in some ways. So Adhikari writes extensively about the linkages between Bharadatta Koirala and his linkages that he had with multilateral agencies like UNESCO, UNDP, UNICEF, and other international organizations like Panos Institute, Asian Media Information Center, and the Asia Foundation. The Nepal Press Institute and worked well with people like Vijayananda Jayavira of the UNESCO. You had Kunta Dikshit of the Interpress Service. And once the broadcasting policy, National Broadcasting Policy of 1992, and subsequently the National Broadcasting Act of 1993 were passed, Koirala and a few other individuals and organizations that he had already worked with on behalf of NPI came together to form a coalition for advocating for community radio. And the advocacy coalition comprised the Nepal Press Institute, the NEFEJ, Worldview International, Himal Association, and other supporting actors. NEFEJ then was headed by Hem Bahadur Bista, Koirala's colleague on another project, and the Himal Association was run by Kanakmani Dikshit, whose brother Kunda Dikshit had worked closely with Koirala. So the supporting actors included individuals who were technology experts and believed in exploiting the new technology of FM radio to break free from the clutches of state broadcasting. Evidently, the Coalition for the Advocacy of Community Radio was based on prior networks established among those who could be seen as the professional elite in Kathmandu to start off. They possessed knowledge on the technological and the socio-political dimensions of what they envisaged as community radio. In addition, they possess the right connections with transnational actors, including intergovernmental organizations, international professional bodies, and donor agencies. The Social Welfare Act of 1992, passed by the government of Nepal, allowed international donor agencies to bring in funding only by working with local NGOs and charitable organizations. These allowed these transnational actors, this allowed these transnational actors to work with not-for-profit organizations that were part of the advocacy coalition for community radio. So the binding and shared normative idea of opening up of the airwaves for participatory radio towards creation of a more plural mediascape in the country enabled the small community of Nepalese community radio advocates supported by transnational actors. And I then, of course, go on to talking about pushing for a broadcast policy shift for community radio. While the National Broadcast Policy of 1992 was the first policy document to mention private players, this was just the beginning of nearly half a decade before the first license was then issued. Raghu Mainali, who was part of the NEFIJ, since the organization was part of the advocacy coalition, spoke about the early days. Even though we had a policy, the bureaucracy could not move ahead since there was no law. This would mean that we had to push for an act. So we started lobbying for an act and regulations, he began narrating, highlighting the legal framework that forms the part of the community radio policy space. And the advocacy coalition then organized, and this was very fascinating for me, because the advocacy coalition then organized a South Asia seminar towards the end of 1992, inviting other broadcasters from South Asia to discuss the possibilities of FM broadcasting. We also invited the Communications Minister Narahari Acharya for the seminar. There, the advocacy coalition involved ourselves in drafting an act unofficially. I must tell you that the minister seemed positive, and this is what Raghu Mainali had narrated when I had met him. Following year, the National Broadcasting Act of 1993 was passed. The advocacy coalition then came up with this with an advocacy strategy plan in 1993. The plan identified various stakeholders and drew up a list of activities to be pursued through them. And they were looking at the diplomatic sector, including INGOs, embassies, UN bodies, etc. They were looking at the larger media sector, the heads of the publicity departments of all political parties to bring in their intervention, and bureaucrats and ministers. At this point, I have a short anecdote to share from my field work, which was about how they brought in the radio set, and this was through a diplomatic channel where they actually smuggled it into the country with the help of UNDP as a diplomatic parcel. And that, I think, was a very fascinating thing for me to understand and get to know, especially because it highlights some solidarities for a larger idea that was being mooted at that point, that seemed revolutionary at that point and did not seem like a possibility just yet. And just capturing the initial days of these journeys, especially in Sri Lanka and Nepal, were very fascinating for me, both pioneers and small countries in the region in their own right, in terms of geography, but bigger in terms of the experiences they've had with media and with working with the state in such a big way, especially because both countries have been marked by different kinds of civil wars in various ways. So these were some of the experiences from these two countries. I'll then move on to India, where I speak about the Indian civil society and community radio policy. Of course, in India, the case has been very different because I think the 1980s and the 1990s saw a different kind of a civil society emerging, especially when you saw that the economy had opened up in the 1990s, early 1990s, you had civil society immediately taking up the, occupying the mantle to ensure that neoliberalism or liberalization of the economy would not adversely affect certain communities. So parallelly, you had the emergence of a number of organizations on ground, NGOs, civil society organizations, community-based organizations, CBOs, etc., who were working in a big way on ground. And I had a former vice president of the AMAC Asia Pacific, and he had been involved with community radio in India since 2004. He pointed out that before the 2006 policy, and in India, like I mentioned, we've had two iterations of the policy, or at least that was the case until the point when I was studying community radio in the region. You had two iterations, one in 2002 and the other in 2006. And in 2002, it was opened up, like I said, to education institutions, and in 2006 to communities. And there was a lot of activism in those 4 years between 2002 and 2006 to open it up to communities, because the state was very, very hesitant. So this former vice president of the AMAC Asia Pacific pointed out that before the 2006 policy, the group of activists and advocates who were a non-registered loose grouping of individuals. However, the policy formalized a community radio sector, bringing in the need for a registered formal body that could continue doing what the earlier network was doing and more. The group had since been involved in negotiating with the other actors involved in the policy process. Similarly, the group also continues to strategically engage on and off with the larger civil society on common causes. So, for instance, the Community Radio Forum had liaison with the Right to Information movement in India in some ways, when they organized a conference, which was the National Convention for People's Right to Information, the NCPRI in 2013, which I also got a chance to attend. And also promoting on-air space as a site for engaging with RTI. So that was happening. And since the announcement of the 2006 community radio policy, the group organized itself as a focal point for negotiations and deliberations, consolidating certain ideas and values in the communicative spaces that these groups create. This is just to give you an idea that what started off as a movement in India and what started off as a site of cross-country learnings from Sri Lanka and Nepal quickly became, especially because India became the first country in the region to have a policy document. It led to the formalization of the space and the transformation of the movement itself into some kind of a formalized policy space. And this, in hindsight, it's reflecting a lot on the trajectories that social movements and movements related to the media as well, social movements related to the media, the trajectories they take, because even in Nepal, with while there was a huge movement, and especially after 2006, we see that the people involved with the advocacy coalition, for instance, have taken on different kind of organizational entities. You have the birth of the ACORAB, and ACORAB itself has undergone a couple of shifts in the country. So this is just to say that when one tracks policy through time, through policy ethnographies, and through the engaging with policy histories academically, one is able to see how policy advocates and policy actors of different kinds transform over time. They take on different, they become different entities over time, especially when they emerge from movements which are successful in making a policy shift with the government or with the state. They then become sort of the sites for expert driven kind of policy inputs that they give to the state, or they become content syndicates, like it has happened in some countries, or they become membership driven organizations where you have the Community Radio Association of India, for instance, which is an association of the functional community radios in the country. So the various trajectories that advocates and activists take have been make for fascinating study, especially in South Asia. I then move on to look at the what is called the associate.
I think we have to stop because we are. Yes, we have
Okay.
already. We have already taken time. So should
Okay,
we
sure.
now? Let's take a few questions.
Yeah.
Do anybody has any questions?
So I'll just round it off. I mean,
Okay,
just to
please,
draw
please.
on all these learnings to say that the experiences have not, in each of these countries in South Asia, have not been in isolation. There are larger international development priorities. There are on-ground activism. There is the nation state which intervenes in a big way. So these are, and colonialism and a crypto-colonial past. All of this make for a shared common kind of learnings and experiences, though the individual trajectories that each of the countries have taken have been different. The communion of a number of activists and advocates for community radio, especially in the initial days, did make for a lot of cross-country kind of learnings from each other in the region. And perhaps that serves as a lens, a region serves as a lens to study policy making in a big way. So I'll end on that note.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have any question? I'm just curious to know. In the beginning, I want to thank you very much because I also read some part of your book, and it's very interesting because you have come up with new way of understanding policy making in South Asia. All you told us that you got both official and unofficial narrative of community radio in Sri Lanka. I'm interested to know what is the official narrative that.
See, the official narrative is that, I spoke to bureaucrats and ministers, but it was very difficult to access the state at that point when I had visited because it was a post-conflict state. And I knew that I was being watched. And through all of this, maybe I'll use this, I'll come back to your question, but I'll use this as a lens also to place on record my role as a researcher, which I write about in my methodology, and where when you're doing fieldwork which is outside your, which is outside the country that you are a citizen of, especially policy work, it sort of becomes important to ensure that you carry an understanding of the country that you're going to, and India acts as a big brother in the region. So to ensure that you don't impose certain preconceived notions and to try and carry learnings back from the field to reflect back on your own country as well. So, that's also one way of looking at cross-country learnings. But this is, I'm bringing this up because access to government departments as a citizen of another country in a post-conflict situation was hard. But I did speak to a few officials and I couldn't access ministers in Sri Lanka, though I could do that in Nepal. In Sri Lanka, I spoke to joint secretaries and secretaries in the ministry of the country's ministry of, I don't know what the terminology is. I use it in my book, the nodal point for communication. And their story is of cooperation with UNESCO and Danida. So, but the personal angle of these and the personal influences and the personal narratives of the broadcasters or the individuals who have been part of these development agencies are often missing from policy stories, and that is the gap that I wanted to fill.
Okay, let's just add, in policy studies, we often talk about heroic narrative. So how you differentiate between heroic narrative and that's unofficial narrative?
A heroic narrative.
Yeah.
Well, see, everybody wants to present the best sort of narrative of how they were the ones who pushed the policy envelope. And I got that a lot. But I document all of that in my work because it's not for me to judge which narrative holds true, because a lot of times multiple pressure points also push for policy, right? It's not only one person's story. So to bring in these multiple perspectives and to say that this was said by this individual. However, there was a contradiction in the story when this other individual brought in a different entry point or a different vantage point. To lay it down as a policy narrative makes your job as a researcher more sincere and also easy, because your job is not to sit in judgment of which narrative is true, but to make space for those plural narratives to emerge and let the reader follow up or be informed of these multiple kind of entry points.
Thank you. Do you have another question?
I think there was something on chat. I'm unable to read it because I'm on my phone. I just have to.
No, there isn't.
I think it's a direct message to me. Was community radio used as a propaganda tool of the Mahaweli mega project by its consortium of funding agencies? Your impression? I mean, if I can say propaganda, I don't know if the word is propaganda, but it was definitely used as a tool to facilitate their project and to then cater to some voices on ground, because this was about the displacement of 1,25,000 families. And they were looking at maintaining some kind of a community connect and helping. I mean, the larger narrative is that of helping communities, but I think there was a felt need for some kind of a communication process to sort of navigate the situation that they had thrown, all these communities and families into. So definitely it was part of that larger machinery of the state and of the international development agencies.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is.
Thank you for your nice presentation. I have a question. How strong is radio broadcaster, community radio broadcasters in other countries? You also mentioned the role of Akorab in Nepal. It is strong, strong in coverage and the politics it does in this sector, and it always raises voice to amend the existing laws and policies for community radio. But Nepal state never recognize community radio legally, and there is not any clear division between community radio and commercial radio. So, yeah, could you elaborate the role of Broadcasters Association in other three countries?
Other countries, yeah. In Sri Lanka, unfortunately, they don't have a community radio station anymore. It stopped with they never did, in the sense that it was always under the Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation, and they did community-based broadcasting because those who chose to work with communities or were using the radio, the Sri Lanka Broadcasting's radio stations as community radio in some sense, were working with communities and were engaging in community programming. But and after that, you had the Kotmale experiment, which was some kind of a hybrid space with internet being intertwined with community radio, and it became part of that community informatics kind of a project. But having said that, in the other countries, in India, you have something called the Community Radio Association, like I mentioned, which has been a membership organization, membership-driven organization of the 200, 250 plus community radio stations in the country. And they constantly lobby with the government for certain kinds of, demands that they have from the community radio station side. And in India, because the policy there, you have a policy guideline recognizing community radio as community radio, it becomes a little easier because they can then clearly demarcate what's happening and how they can lobby for certain ideas. But the caveat is things have changed dramatically in the last few years. And now you have a number of community radio stations which serve as some kind of repeat broadcasters of the All India Radio. Because the state has a huge agenda today and is not very appreciative of localized broadcasting if it defies the directives of the state. So you have the state becoming very strong, and therefore any kind of lobbying and advocacy, any kind of lobbying and advocacy that happens is in the form of asking for advertising rates or asking for schemes and programs that allow for better functioning of community radios, than to speak of something like freedom of expression or the expansion of the sector itself in areas where there are some kind of unofficial blanket bans, because not all organizations are licensed these community radios. They do a background check. The Ministry of Home Affairs is very much involved in giving out certificates of which organizations are considered good organizations that can run these stations, etc. So it is a highly securitized setup, especially today. And therefore, I don't know if, while the organization itself has been successful in making space for the needs of community radio stations, the larger context itself is very defeatist for the larger ethos and that romantic idea of community radios being sites of freedom of expression and the right to communicate. I mean, that has been slightly on a decline, and this is my personal impression. Having said that, you do have some stations doing wonderful work, especially during the pandemic in India. So that is just to give you a sense of the larger landscape and how these nodal actors in the civil society space for community radio work with the state. I mean, what do they ask for and what do they not ask for? What are they allowed to ask for is something that the context decides. Having said that, in Bangladesh, it's a very different story, because I mean, NGOs have for the longest time, Bangladesh has been called the basket case of development. NGOs have constantly been at the forefront of even informing the state and informing governance in a big way. But again, they work within the ambits of what is permissible. However, BNNRC has been playing a huge role in working with the community radio stations, in working with the government in a big way to ensure, like, it's happened in a phased manner. Like I said, because they did not allow community radios to concentrate in the capital city or in one particular district, etc. They spread it across the country, and it's happening in a very planned manner. First they allowed 14 stations to come up, and then the next 14 were allowed. So it's happening in a very phased and planned manner, where BNNRC works with the government to shape the sector in a big way. So it's not, I don't know if there is an activist element to it, but there is a more of a professionalized relation today between people who were former activists or people who are part of movements formally, but then become professionalized policy actors in that sense.
Thank you. We have a question from Facebook. Giri Panthi writes, what about political tilt of community radios and media ethics? Any comparative study in your research?
Sorry, I'm not able to. What about political?
What about political tilt of community radios and media ethics? Any comparative study in your research?
Well, I haven't. Because the focus of my work was to look at policy making. I didn't get into the politics of individual stations, but I do mention in my book, at least in the Indian context, there are narratives of how after a particular point in the 2000s, after a shift in government, newer players have entered the landscape, the media landscape in a big way. The media landscape has changed in a big way in India. And in the community radio space, you have certain vested political interests asking for licenses and getting licenses to run it for their own political purposes. So, of course, that has happened, and it continues to happen, because you get something like community radio license, which is a very subsidized access to spectrum, which is so costly, and which you have licensing and bidding for, and for private FMs. But in India, because they are recognized as community radios, the cost of the spectrum is given at a very subsidized rate. But using that medium, if you can run, if you can find support for your political ideas, then it's a very profitable enterprise. So there are a number of actors who are entering the scene in that sense. And of course, one doesn't have to comment on the media ethics part, because of course it is supremely unethical, to say the least.
Do you have other questions? Yeah, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Okay, I'm just curious. Even in Nepal, it said that because in the beginning it was, propagated as the first South Asian community radio in a way, as a first South Asian community radio, and later it was, it was found it is not true. And it even said that in the beginning, these people were even looking for radios, and then they look for community. So is this happening only in Nepal or in other countries as well?
Definitely in the other countries as well, because I think the early ideas, or the sense I got, was the early ideas with community radio station. Of course, there was always an international impetus to it. It was my understanding is that while there could have been a felt need in communities for communication outlets and for sites of expression, that a lot of the advocates then could use as for advocacy, it was also an international kind of an impetus that it received, and it was a transnational idea in that sense. So the mixing of how state interests operate, how transnational impetus operates, and how localized community needs operate at any given point in the political, socioeconomic landscape and context of a country, all of this has determined how community radio has the trajectory it has taken in each of these countries. So in the other countries as well, you have people who are NGOs who license out stations and get licenses for stations, but then decide how they want to run a program according to their NGOs agendas, right? So we don't know if the actual ethos of community participation in terms of catering to the community's needs or community's wishes are happening in a big way.
Thank you. Do you have other questions? Yeah, we still have time. Do you have other questions? Okay, let me.
I have one question that was sent to me. In Nepal,
Okay, please.
community radio has been monopolized by a clutch of NGOs that produce programs in Kathmandu that are broadcast by a large number of local NGOs. Very little local news gets onto a local FMs. Your own impression again from your interactions in Nepal. So like I was mentioning, this content syndicization had already happened or was beginning to happen in a big way when I was doing my fieldwork, where Kathmandu-based programming was done and then relayed in other stations in far off, areas in the mountains, and that's what was happening. So I was very aware of that when I was doing the field work in Nepal.
Thank you. Should we also talk about media assistance? Now it seems that in a way, in community radio, charm has in a way gone out. So was that effect of that media assistance or interest of donors?
Well, I don't know now I think the next space in media studies or in the media space has been about misinformation and media literacy. So I think that's where a lot of the focus today is on. And community radio for donors has gone out of fashion in some sense. But It could also be because, I mean, a lot of times I get asked, so why did you study community radio in the age of AI? And is it because of, I mean, we don't know if it's gone out of fashion because of the technologies or because of the priorities and the resurgence of the nation state. The state has become a strong player in a big way, especially in the region, a number of these countries. So is it because, like, for instance, in India, you have, I mean, FCRA, I mean, which is the foreign contribution, that act has been used in a restrictive fashion to ensure that NGOs don't get foreign funding, right? So with all those priorities, you then have to address newer areas which are not so controversial in some ways. So that could be one reason why it has gone out of fashion. Technology advances could be one reason. But my argument is that we live in, at least in this part of the world, we are living with multiple temporalities, in the sense that you have people who have different needs, media needs, at any given point in time existing at the same time. I mean, while we are talking, like, I live in a city where you have facial recognition and AI sensors being deployed at the city level. But when I go sort of to remote areas, you still don't have that kind of access to technologies, for good or bad. So you have multiple needs. This is to say that you have multiple needs, and it's not that one technology replaces another completely. You just have different sections of population making their own space in the larger media system. So how do you ensure that the media system caters to these multiple kind of needs that people have for media and communication? I mean, that is the larger question, not so much about technology advances or what should be funded and what shouldn't be funded.
Thank you. I think we don't have other questions. Let us close today's program. Do you have anything to say at the end? Do you have anything to say at the end of this program, Preeti?
Well, I just want to thank you for being a patient audience and giving me this opportunity again.
Yeah, thank you very much to Preeti and all of you for coming to today's program. Yeah, bye. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.